I was born and raised in the small town of Ashland, Kentucky. My mother-in-law died when I authorized the doctors to use that machine at a hospital in Southern California. My own husband looked at me and accused me of murder. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to fight back, because this decision did not just cost my marriage, it broke the last thread of connection we had. I met my husband David 23 years ago at a community college in Kentucky. He was charming and ambitious, always talking about moving west and building something big. I was young and believed in him. We got married within a year and moved to Los Angeles when he got a job opportunity. His mother, Patricia, stayed behind in Kentucky, but visited us often. She was a kind woman who worked as a school librarian for 30 years. She raised David mostly on her own after his father left when David was 10. Patricia never remarried and poured everything into making sure her son had opportunities. When Patricia retired at 65, she sold her house in Kentucky and moved into a small apartment near us in Glendale. She wanted to be close to family as she got older. David seemed happy about it at first, but within months I noticed he rarely visited her. He was always too busy with work or his hobbies. I started checking on Patricia twice a week, then almost daily. We would have tea together and watch old movies. She told me stories about raising David as a single mother and how proud she was of the man he became. I felt closer to Patricia than I did to my own mother, who had passed away when I was 19. Patricia had diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions she managed with medication and regular doctor visits. I drove her to most of her appointments because David was always working late. She trusted me with her medical information and made me her secondary emergency contact. David was listed first, but Patricia told me she put me second because she knew I would actually answer the phone. That comment hurt because it was true. David had become distant not just from his mother, but from me too. He spent more time at the office than at home. When he was home, he was on his phone or watching television. We barely talked anymore. 3 years after Patricia moved to California, David started his own consulting business. He was excited and confident, convinced he would make a fortune. I supported him, even though it meant we had to take out a second mortgage on our house to fund his startup costs. Patricia also gave him $20,000 from her retirement savings to help. She believed in her son and wanted to see him succeed. David promised he would pay her back with interest once the business took off. The business struggled from the start. David had clients, but not enough to cover his expenses. He kept saying he just needed more time, that the market would turn around. I worked full-time as an office manager to keep our household afloat while David poured money into his failing venture. He became irritable and defensive whenever I asked about the business finances. He stopped showing me the bank statements. I trusted him to handle it, which was my first mistake. Patricia's health began declining when she turned 71. Her diabetes worsened despite medication adjustments. She developed kidney problems and had to start dialysis 3 times a week. I rearranged my work schedule to drive her to treatments. David visited her maybe once a month, always rushed and distracted. Patricia never complained about his absence, but I could see the sadness in her eyes when she asked about him. She would say he was busy building his future and that she understood. I wanted to shake David and make him see what he was missing, but I kept quiet to avoid fights. The dialysis helped for a while, but Patricia's kidneys continued to fail. Her doctors discussed the possibility of a transplant, but at her age, with her other conditions, she was not considered a strong candidate. They focused on managing her symptoms and keeping her comfortable. Patricia accepted this with grace. She told me she had lived a good life and was not afraid of what came next. She made me promise to take care of David after she was gone. She said he needed someone stable because he had always been impulsive and reckless with money, just like his father. 6 months before Patricia died, David's business collapsed completely. He had been hiding the extent of his financial problems from me. I discovered we were drowning in debt. He had maxed out our credit cards, taken out personal loans, and borrowed money from friends. We owed over $200,000. The house was weeks away from foreclosure. I was furious and terrified. David broke down and admitted he had made terrible decisions, invested in the wrong ventures, trusted the wrong partners. He begged me to help him fix it. I worked with a financial advisor to consolidate our debts and create a repayment plan. It would take years to dig ourselves out, but it was possible if we were disciplined. David got a regular job again, swallowing his pride to work for someone else. The stress aged him. He became bitter and resentful, angry at the world for his failures. He started drinking more. Our marriage became a cold arrangement of shared bills and separate lives. We slept in the same bed, but barely touched. I stayed because I had invested too much to walk away, and because I still remembered the man I married 23 years ago. Patricia did not know about David's financial collapse. We kept it from her to avoid adding stress. She was getting weaker and spent more time in the hospital with infections and complications. I visited her every day, sometimes twice. I held her hand and read to her. She would drift in and out of sleep, sometimes confused about where she was. The doctor said her body was shutting down. They recommended we consider hospice care to keep her comfortable in her final weeks or months. David refused to discuss hospice. He insisted his mother would recover, that she just needed more aggressive treatment. I think he could not face losing her because it would mean confronting his own failures as a son. He had been absent for years and now wanted to make up for it by demanding doctors do everything possible. But Patricia had already told me privately that she did not want extreme measures. She was tired and ready to go. She made me promise not to let them torture her with machines and procedures that would only prolong her suffering. The crisis happened on a Tuesday in March. I got a call from the hospital at 4 a.m. Patricia had been brought in by ambulance after her neighbor found her unresponsive in her apartment. She had suffered respiratory failure. By the time I arrived, she was on a ventilator in the intensive care unit. David showed up an hour later, looking exhausted and smelling like alcohol. The doctors explained that Patricia's lungs were badly damaged from an infection. Her kidneys had also failed completely. She was in septic shock and her organs were shutting down. The doctors presented us with options. They could continue life support and see if antibiotics could fight the infection, but her prognosis was poor. Even if she survived, she would likely need permanent ventilation and dialysis. She would never leave the hospital. The other option was to make her comfortable and let nature take its course. She would die within hours or days. There was also a third experimental option, a new machine that could oxygenate blood outside the body while giving the lungs time to heal. It was called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. The hospital had just acquired the equipment and had limited experience with it. The doctors were honest that it was a long shot, especially given Patricia's age and multiple organ failures, but it was the only chance of meaningful recovery. David latched onto the ECMO machine immediately. He demanded they use it, insisting his mother was a fighter and deserved every chance. I reminded him of what Patricia had told me about not wanting extreme measures. David exploded. He accused me of wanting his mother to die, of being cold and heartless. He said I was not family and had no right to make decisions about his mother's care. The doctors looked uncomfortable and asked us to step outside to discuss it privately. In the hallway, David and I had the worst fight of our marriage. He was desperate and irrational, clinging to false hope. I tried to explain that Patricia would not want this, that we would be torturing her for our own inability to let go. David said I was just trying to save money, that I was worried about medical bills cutting into our debt repayment plan. His accusation was so cruel and unfair that I could not speak. I had spent years caring for his mother while he barely visited. I had held her hand through every scary diagnosis and painful treatment. I loved Patricia like my own mother. The doctors needed a decision. David was listed as the primary contact, but he was falling apart. He could not stop crying and was bordering on hysterical. The doctors pulled me aside and said they needed someone who could think clearly about what was best for Patricia. They explained the risks of ECMO in detail. The machine could cause bleeding, blood clots, infection, and stroke. Given Patricia's condition, the chance of survival was less than 10%. Even if she survived, the recovery would be long and brutal. She would likely have permanent disabilities. But without the machine, she would definitely die within 24 hours. I asked David to make the decision. He was her son, but he could not do it. He was paralyzed by guilt and fear. He just kept saying to do everything, to use every machine, to not let her die. I realized he was not thinking about Patricia at all. He was thinking about himself and his inability to cope with loss. So I made the decision. I authorized the use of the ECMO machine. I signed the consent forms. I did it because even though I knew Patricia would not want it, I could not be the one to deny David his last hope. I could not live with him blaming me for giving up on his mother. They put Patricia on the ECMO machine that afternoon. She looked so small and fragile, surrounded by tubes and equipment. Machines breathed for her, pumped her blood, monitored every function. David sat by her bedside holding her hand, talking to her like she could hear him. He apologized for not being around more, promised he would do better, begged her to fight. I stood in the corner watching, feeling like an intruder in their moment. Patricia lasted 4 days on ECMO. Her body fought against the machine. She developed blood clots that traveled to her brain. She had a massive stroke. The doctors said there was no brain activity left. She was gone. They asked about removing life support. David finally accepted it was over. They turned off the machines, and Patricia died within minutes. She was 71 years old. David blamed me immediately. As we stood in that hospital room with his mother's body still warm, he turned to me with pure hatred in his eyes. He said, "I killed her." I signed the consent form for the machine that caused the blood clots and the stroke. If I had just let her go peacefully, she would have died with dignity instead of being tortured by equipment. He said I made the decision to use the machine so I could tell myself we tried everything, that I was covering my own conscience at his mother's expense. Nothing I said mattered. He had decided I was responsible for her death. The funeral was small. Patricia had outlived most of her friends, and her family was scattered. David did not speak to me during the service. He sat on the opposite side of the chapel. Afterward, people asked if we were okay. I made excuses about grief affecting everyone differently, but I knew something had broken permanently between us. David moved into the guest room that night. He communicated with me only through notes left on the kitchen counter. 2 weeks after the funeral, David served me with divorce papers. I was not surprised. What surprised me was the additional lawsuit attached. He was suing me for wrongful death and medical negligence. The claim stated that I had made unauthorized medical decisions against the patient's wishes and against the recommendation of family, resulting in Patricia's death. He was seeking damages for emotional distress, loss of companionship, and funeral expenses. The amount was $250,000. I hired a lawyer immediately. She reviewed the case and said it was absurd. I had not committed any crime or negligence. I was authorized to make medical decisions as the secondary emergency contact. The consent form I signed clearly outlined all risks. The doctors had recommended the ECMO machine as an option. There was no malpractice. David's lawsuit would likely be dismissed, but it would be expensive to defend, and the process would be humiliating. My lawyer said David was lashing out in grief and would probably drop it once he calmed down. David did not calm down. He escalated. He gave interviews to local news stations about how the hospital and his wife had killed his mother with an experimental machine. He posted on social media about medical negligence and patient rights. He painted me as a monster who had seized control of his mother's care and made reckless decisions. Some of our mutual friends believed him. They stopped returning my calls. My coworkers saw the news stories. My boss called me in for a meeting to discuss the negative attention. I felt my entire life unraveling. The discovery process for the lawsuit revealed David's true motivation. My lawyer subpoenaed financial records and found something disturbing. David had taken out a life insurance policy on his mother 2 years earlier without telling anyone. The policy was for $500,000 with David as the sole beneficiary. He had been paying the premiums from a secret bank account. When my lawyer dug deeper, she found that David's financial situation was even worse than I knew. He owed money to dangerous people. He had borrowed from loan sharks to keep his business afloat before it collapsed. He was being threatened. He needed money desperately. Patricia's death triggered the life insurance payout, but there was a problem. David's lawsuit against me for wrongful death created a complication. If he won, or if there was a settlement, the insurance company might delay or reduce the payout, arguing that the death was due to negligence rather than natural causes. My lawyer believed David had filed the lawsuit, not because he actually blamed me, but to create leverage. He was planning to pressure me into a settlement where I would accept blame and pay him damages. Then he would drop the wrongful death claim, clear the way for the insurance payout, and walk away with over $700,000 total. I was devastated. The man I had loved for 23 years, the man I had stood by through his failures and supported through his darkest times, was willing to destroy my reputation and financial future to cover his debts. He was using his mother's death as a tool for extortion. He did not care that I had been the one to care for Patricia, that I had loved her, that I was drowning in grief too. I was just an obstacle between him and money. My lawyer advised me to fight. We could expose David's scheme, show that the lawsuit was frivolous and motivated by financial gain rather than genuine grievance, but fighting would be expensive and time-consuming. I was already struggling to pay legal fees. David knew I did not have resources for a prolonged battle. He was counting on me to fold. The moment my husband's lawyer claimed I committed medical negligence was when I realized I was fighting not for my marriage, but for my life. I used every penny I had to hire a forensic auditor to expose his hidden debts and his true intent. I need your advice. Now, this is where I did that risky move. Tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong to risk my financial future to expose the man I once loved for who he really is. I borrowed money from my brother to pay for the forensic audit. The auditor traced David's financial activities over the past 5 years. The picture that emerged was uglier than I imagined. David had not just failed as a businessman, he had committed fraud. He had falsified invoices to clients, embezzled money from business partners, and filed false tax returns. He had taken out loans using forged documents. He had opened credit cards in my name without my knowledge and maxed them out. I was liable for debts I did not even know existed. The total amount we owed was closer to $400,000, not the $200,000 I thought. The auditor also discovered something else. Patricia had updated her will 6 months before she died. She had originally left everything to David, which was not much, just her apartment and about $50,000 in savings. But in the new will, she left everything to me. There was a letter attached explaining her decision. Patricia wrote that she knew David was in financial trouble. She knew he had a gambling problem and made poor choices. She trusted me to handle her affairs responsibly and wanted to make sure I was taken care of since I had been so devoted to her. The will had been filed with her attorney, but David did not know about it because Patricia died before she could tell him. This changed everything. David's life insurance payout was secure, but he would not get Patricia's estate. I would. It was not a fortune, but $50,000 would help me survive the divorce and rebuild. More importantly, the will proved that Patricia trusted me completely with her care and decisions. It destroyed David's narrative that I had acted against her wishes. My lawyer was excited. She said we could use the will and the forensic audit to not only defeat David's wrongful death lawsuit, but to countersue him for fraud and emotional distress. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to take the high road to just end this nightmare and move on with my life. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt and betrayed and publicly humiliated, wanted justice. I wanted David to face consequences for what he had done to me, to his mother's memory, to everyone who had trusted him. My lawyer said I had every right to fight back, that David had declared war and I needed to defend myself aggressively. So I agreed. We filed a countersuit and requested an expedited court date. The countersuit accused David of fraud, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We included evidence of his hidden life insurance policy, his secret debts, his loans from criminals, and his embezzlement. We presented Patricia's updated will and her letter. We showed that David had filed the wrongful death lawsuit purely to extort money from me and clear the path for his insurance claim. We painted him as a con artist who had used his mother's death as a financial scheme. David's response was to double down. His lawyer issued a statement calling me vindictive and accusing me of forging Patricia's will. They claimed the will was fake, created after Patricia's death to steal her estate. They said the forensic audit was biased and that my lawyer had manufactured evidence. They demanded a handwriting analysis of the will and a full investigation into my relationship with Patricia. David gave more media interviews portraying himself as a grieving son being victimized by his calculating wife. The handwriting analysis confirmed Patricia's will was genuine. The investigation into my relationship with Patricia only strengthened my case. Hospital staff testified that I had been Patricia's primary caregiver and visitor. Her doctors confirmed that I had always acted in her best interests and followed her wishes. Her neighbors said I was the only family member they ever saw. Patricia's attorney testified that she had been of sound mind when she updated her will and that she had specifically expressed concerns about David's financial irresponsibility. As the evidence mounted against him, David became desperate. He tried to settle out of court, offering to drop his wrongful death lawsuit if I dropped my countersuit and gave him half of Patricia's estate. My lawyer told me to reject it. We had him cornered. If we went to trial, David would lose everything and possibly face criminal charges for fraud. I rejected his settlement offer. I wanted my day in court. I wanted him exposed. The trial was scheduled for 9 months after Patricia's death. Those months were the hardest of my life. I was living alone in our house, which was still in foreclosure proceedings. I worked long hours to pay legal fees and basic expenses. I had no social life because most friends had taken sides or wanted to avoid drama. I lost weight and could not sleep. I kept thinking about Patricia and wondering if I had made the right decision about the ECMO machine. Even though I knew she would have understood, I carried guilt. If I had refused the machine and let her die peacefully, none of this would have happened. But I also knew David would have blamed me anyway. He needed someone to blame for his failures. The trial lasted 2 weeks. David's lawyer tried to argue that the wrongful death lawsuit had been filed in good faith, that David genuinely believed I had acted negligently. They portrayed David as a grieving son who had made poor financial decisions but was not a criminal. They argued that the life insurance policy was a responsible act of planning, not a scheme. They claimed Patricia's will had been influenced by me during a vulnerable time, but our evidence was overwhelming. The forensic audit showed clear patterns of fraud and deception. Patricia's letter explicitly stated she was making her own decision without influence. The timeline proved David had taken out the life insurance policy while already in massive debt, suggesting premeditation. The prosecution also brought in an expert witness, a medical ethicist who reviewed Patricia's case. The expert testified that my decision to authorize ECMO was reasonable given the circumstances. I had been presented with 3 options by doctors and had chosen the one that offered a chance of survival, even if it was slim. The expert said the complications Patricia suffered were known risks that I had been informed about and accepted. There was no negligence. If anything, I had acted courageously by making an impossible decision when the primary contact was unable to do so. David took the stand in his own defense. It was painful to watch. He was combative and defensive, contradicting himself multiple times. He admitted he had not been present for most of his mother's care, but insisted he knew what she would have wanted better than anyone. He claimed the life insurance policy was a coincidence. When confronted with evidence of his fraud and embezzlement, he broke down and blamed stress and desperation. He said he had made mistakes, but never intended to hurt anyone. He looked pathetic and broken. Part of me felt sorry for him, but most of me felt nothing. When it was my turn to testify, I told the truth. I described my relationship with Patricia, the years of care I had provided, the conversations we had about her wishes. I explained the impossible situation in the hospital and why I made the decision I did. I admitted I had doubts and guilt, but maintained that I acted in what I believed were Patricia's best interests given the circumstances. I testified about discovering David's debts, his schemes, and his betrayal. I cried on the stand, not from sadness, but from exhaustion and relief at finally telling my story. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found in my favor on all counts. They dismissed David's wrongful death lawsuit and awarded me damages for defamation and emotional distress. The amount was $75,000. More importantly, the verdict cleared my name publicly. The judge also referred David's case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution based on the fraud evidence presented. The life insurance company, which had been holding the payout pending the lawsuit's outcome, released the $500,000 to David, but he would not enjoy it. His creditors immediately filed claims against the payout. The loan sharks he owed money to were not going to wait. David's lawyer fees had consumed most of his remaining resources. After everything was settled, David was left with barely $100,000 and a criminal investigation hanging over his head. I received Patricia's estate as outlined in her will. The $50,000 helped me start over. I sold our house to pay off the debts that were legitimately mine and cleared my credit. I moved to a small apartment in Pasadena and started rebuilding. The $75,000 in damages from David covered my legal fees, with some left over for savings. I changed jobs to escape the stigma and started therapy to process everything I had been through. David disappeared from my life completely after the trial. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to Nevada and was working in sales. The criminal investigation eventually led to charges for tax fraud and embezzlement. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received probation and a fine. He avoided prison, but his reputation was destroyed. He lost his professional licenses and would struggle to find legitimate work. His life, like mine, was permanently altered by the choices he made. I think about Patricia often. I visit her grave every few months and tell her about my life. I thank her for trusting me and for protecting me with her will. I tell her I am sorry for the pain she endured in her final days, even though I know she would not blame me. She was the kind of person who understood that impossible decisions sometimes have to be made, and that love means doing the hard thing even when it hurts. I hope she is at peace and knows that I fought for her memory. The question that haunts me is whether I should have walked away instead of fighting. When David filed his lawsuit and launched his campaign against me, I could have settled quietly, paid him something, and disappeared. It would have been less painful and less expensive. But I would have lived the rest of my life carrying the false accusation of negligence and murder. I would have let him get away with using his mother's death for profit. I would have betrayed Patricia's trust in me. So I fought, and the fight destroyed whatever was left of my life with David. It cost me friendships, my home, my sense of safety. But it also gave me justice and the truth. I cleared my name and exposed David for what he really was. I do not regret fighting, but I regret that fighting was necessary. I regret that the man I married became someone capable of such cruelty. I regret that Patricia's death was not allowed to be just a death, that it became a weapon and a transaction. I regret that I will never know if she would have survived without the ECMO machine, if a peaceful death in those first 24 hours would have been more merciful. I carry these regrets every day. My life now is quiet and small. I work as an office manager for a nonprofit. I have a few close friends who stuck by me through everything. I date occasionally but have no interest in remarrying. I am 48 years old and feel ancient. The last few years aged me in ways that have nothing to do with time. I am more cautious now, more guarded. I do not trust easily, and I do not open my heart the way I once did. Patricia's death and David's betrayal taught me that love is not always enough, that people can change or reveal themselves in ways that shatter everything you believed. But I also learned that I am stronger than I thought. I survived something that should have broken me. I stood up for myself when it would have been easier to surrender. I honored the woman who had been like a mother to me by refusing to let her memory be twisted into something ugly. I did what Patricia would have wanted me to do. She was a fighter in her own quiet way, and she taught me to be one too. The anniversary of Patricia's death is next month. I plan to visit her grave and bring flowers, like I do every year. I will sit with her and tell her about my life, about the small victories and the ongoing struggles. I will thank her again for the gift she left me, not just the money, but the validation that I had done right by her. I will ask her, like I always do, if I made the right decision in that hospital. I never get an answer, but asking helps me process the guilt I still carry. I think about the machine often, the ECMO device that was supposed to save Patricia, but instead, through terrible luck and medical complications, contributed to her death. I know the machine itself was not evil. It was just a tool, a desperate attempt to reverse the irreversible. but it became the symbol of everything that went wrong. David blamed the machine. He blamed me for authorizing it. But the real villain was not the machine or me. It was the impossible situation we were put in, the lack of good options, the cruelty of diseases that slowly destroy the people we love. If I could go back to that moment in the hospital when the doctors were asking for a decision, I do not know what I would do differently. Patricia had made her wishes clear to me in private conversations. She did not want extreme measures. She wanted to die with dignity. But she had also said those things when death was abstract and distant. In the actual moment of crisis, with David desperate and the doctors offering a chance, even a tiny chance, I could not say no. I could not be the one to give up. Maybe that was weakness. Maybe I should have been stronger and honored Patricia's wishes over David's grief. But I was human, and I was scared, and I wanted to believe in miracles. David never understood that I was trying to protect him from himself. I knew he would blame whoever made the decision to let his mother go. If I had refused the ECMO machine and Patricia had died within hours, David would have spent the rest of his life believing we could have saved her if only we had tried. He would have blamed me for giving up too soon. By authorizing the machine, I at least gave him the comfort of knowing we tried everything. We used every option available. Patricia's death was not from lack of effort or care. It was from her body being too damaged to repair. But David was too consumed by his own agenda to see that. He saw only an opportunity to shift blame and solve his financial problems. The insurance money David received did not save him. Money was never David's real problem. His real problem was his inability to accept responsibility for his choices. He had spent years making bad decisions, trusting the wrong people, chasing schemes that were too good to be true. He had neglected his mother and his wife while pursuing success that always stayed just out of reach. When everything collapsed, he needed someone to blame. I was convenient. His mother's death was convenient. The lawsuit was just another scheme, another attempt to escape consequences. I wonder sometimes if David feels remorse, if he lies awake at night thinking about what he destroyed, if he misses his mother and regrets not spending more time with her when she was alive, if he remembers the good years of our marriage before everything went wrong. I will never know because we do not speak. We have no reason to. The divorce is final. The lawsuits are settled. We have no children or shared property. We are strangers now, connected only by a painful history. The media attention eventually faded. For a few months I was a local news story, a cautionary tale about medical decisions and family conflict. Then other stories took over and people forgot. My coworkers stopped asking about it. New friends I made had no idea about my past unless I chose to tell them. I became anonymous again, which was a relief. I did not want to be defined by tragedy and conflict. I wanted to be just another person trying to live a quiet life. But the experience changed me permanently. I am more aware now of how quickly life can fall apart, how someone you trust completely can become a stranger, how institutions like marriage and family can crumble under pressure. I am less naive about human nature. I see selfishness and manipulation more clearly. I protect myself more carefully. Some people might call this cynical. I call it wisdom earned through suffering. Patricia would tell me to let go of the bitterness. She believed in forgiveness and moving forward. She never held grudges and always saw the best in people, even David. But Patricia also had boundaries. She knew when to protect herself. That is why she changed her will. She saw what I was too blind to see, that David was not capable of handling responsibility, that he would make choices that hurt people. She tried to protect me in the only way she could. I wish I had understood sooner. I wish I had seen the warning signs before it was too late. The legal battle taught me that justice exists, but it is expensive and exhausting. Winning in court did not undo the damage. It did not restore my marriage or my reputation or my peace of mind. It just stopped David from profiting from his cruelty. It cleared my name officially, but could not erase the suspicion and gossip that had spread. Some people still believe I killed Patricia. They heard David's accusations and never heard the verdict. That is the nature of scandal. The accusation spreads faster and farther than the truth. I learned to live with ambiguity, with knowing some people will always think poorly of me, with understanding that I cannot control how I am perceived. All I can control is my own conscience and my own actions. I know I did the best I could in an impossible situation. I know Patricia trusted me and would not blame me. I know I fought for the truth when it would have been easier to surrender. That has to be enough. My mother-in-law rests in peace, and my name is finally clear, but the silence in my life is deafening. I lost my husband, my home, and the life I built over 20 years. I know I will never have a normal life again. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to execute this final revenge, because this decision broke the last thread of connection we had. Was the justice I found worth losing the man I loved forever? I returned to work a month after the trial ended. My coworkers were kind but distant. They did not know what to say to me. I had become the woman with the tragic story, the one who had been dragged through public humiliation and came out the other side damaged but standing. People treated me with careful politeness, like I might shatter if they said the wrong thing. I hated it. I wanted to be normal again, to have conversations about weekend plans and television shows instead of sympathetic looks and awkward silences. My boss called me into her office during my second week back. She said the company had received calls from reporters asking about me and my employment status. The publicity from the trial had reached our clients. Some had expressed concern about being associated with controversy. My boss was apologetic but firm. She suggested I consider taking a leave of absence until things settled down. It was not exactly a firing, but it was close. I could read between the lines. I was a liability. I resigned that afternoon to save whatever dignity I had left. Unemployment forced me to confront my finances more seriously. The settlement money from David would cover my basic expenses for about a year if I was careful. Patricia's estate had given me a cushion, but it was not enough to live on indefinitely. I needed a new job, but my name was now attached to scandal. Every potential employer who searched for me online would find articles about the trial, about accusations of medical negligence and wrongful death. It did not matter that I had been vindicated. The association alone was damaging. I considered changing my name legally, starting completely fresh with a new identity, but that felt like running away, like admitting I had something to hide. Patricia had trusted me enough to leave me her estate. I owed it to her memory to stand by my actions and my name, so I kept my name and kept applying for jobs, knowing it would be harder, but refusing to erase myself to make others comfortable. The job search took 4 months. I applied to over 60 positions and received 3 interviews. 2 of those interviews ended quickly once my background came up. The hiring managers were polite, but their discomfort was obvious. They thanked me for my time and said they would be in touch. They never were. The 3rd interview was with a small nonprofit that provided services to elderly people. The director was a woman in her 60s named Margaret who had read about my case. She asked me directly about it during the interview. I told her everything. I explained my relationship with Patricia, the medical crisis, the decision about ECMO, and David's subsequent betrayal and lawsuit. I told her about the trial and the verdict. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. She asked if I would make the same decision again, knowing how everything turned out. I thought about it carefully before answering. I said yes, I would. Because in that moment, with the information I had and the people involved, it was the only decision I could live with. Margaret hired me on the spot. Working at the nonprofit felt like a form of redemption. I was helping people in situations similar to what Patricia had faced. Elderly individuals dealing with health crises, navigating medical systems, struggling with family dynamics. I understood their fears and their needs in ways I could not have before my experience. My personal tragedy became useful. It gave me empathy and insight that made me better at my job. Margaret told me after 6 months that I was the best hire she had made in years. That validation meant more than any paycheck. But my professional recovery did not fix my personal life. I was still alone. My marriage was over. Most of my friendships had not survived the scandal. The few friends who remained were kind but busy with their own lives. I spent evenings in my small apartment watching television or reading. Weekends were long stretches of silence broken only by trips to the grocery store or Patricia's retry I continue edit grave. I was lonely in a way I had never experienced before. I had always been part of something, part of a marriage or a family or a community. Now I was just myself, untethered and isolated. I tried online dating briefly. I created a profile that mentioned I was divorced, but left out the details. My first few dates were awkward but harmless. Then I went out with a man named Richard, who seemed nice until he recognized my name. He had followed the trial in the news. He spent the entire dinner asking invasive questions about David and Patricia and the lawsuit. He wanted to know if I had really killed my mother-in-law, if the jury had gotten it wrong, if I was some kind of black widow. I left before the food arrived and deleted my dating profile that night. The isolation pushed me towards therapy. I had resisted it for months, telling myself I was fine and could handle things on my own. But I was not fine. I was depressed and anxious. I had nightmares about the hospital, about signing the consent form, about Patricia dying. I replayed the trial in my mind constantly, analyzing every moment and wondering if I could have done something differently. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen, helped me understand that I was experiencing trauma. The combination of Patricia's death, David's betrayal, and the public nature of the trial had left wounds that needed professional care. Dr. Chen introduced me to the concept of ambiguous loss. She explained that some losses cannot be neatly resolved because they involve contradictions or uncertainties. My loss of David was ambiguous because the man I grieved was not the man he had become. I was mourning the husband I thought I had, the marriage I believed in, while simultaneously hating the person he revealed himself to be. Patricia's death was ambiguous because I carried guilt about the medical decision, even though I knew rationally I had done nothing wrong. These contradictions made healing complicated. Therapy helped me accept that I would always carry some level of guilt and grief. That was not a failure of recovery. It was a realistic acknowledgement of complexity. I had made the best decision I could with impossible options. Patricia had died despite our efforts, not because of them. David had chosen to betray me. His actions were his responsibility, not mine. These truths did not erase my pain, but they helped me carry it more lightly. I started attending a support group for people who had experienced family estrangement. Most of the members had been cut off by parents or siblings over ideological differences or old conflicts. My situation was different, but the emotional experience was similar. the loss of family, the confusion and hurt, the social isolation that came with being separated from people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. Hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone. I was not the only person whose family had imploded. I was not uniquely cursed or broken. One woman in the group, Sandra, became a close friend. She had been estranged from her adult children for 5 years after a bitter divorce. She understood the specific pain of family betrayal during crisis. We started meeting for coffee outside of group sessions. She was the first person I could talk to honestly about my anger. Everyone else wanted me to be forgiving and gracious, to take the high road and move on. Sandra let me be furious. She understood that anger was not the opposite of healing. Sometimes anger was part of healing, a necessary stage of processing betrayal. Through Sandra, I met other people who became my new social circle. None of them knew about the trial unless I chose to tell them. They accepted me as I was in the present, not as the tragic figure from news articles. We had dinner parties and went to movies and complained about work. Normal friendship activities that felt revolutionary after months of isolation. I was building a new life, slowly, one small connection at a time. The first anniversary of Patricia's death was brutal. I took the day off work and spent it at her grave. I brought her favorite flowers, yellow roses, and sat on the grass beside her headstone for hours. I talked to her about everything that had happened since she died. The lawsuit, the trial, the divorce, my new job, my therapy, my slowly rebuilding life. I told her I was sorry for the pain she endured at the end. I told her I missed her. I cried until I had no tears left. As I sat there, I thought about the kind of person Patricia had been. She had faced hardships her entire life, single motherhood, financial struggles, health problems, but she never became bitter or mean. She remained kind and generous, even when life was unfair. She found joy in small things like old movies and good tea. She loved fiercely, even when that love was not returned in equal measure. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. I wanted to honor her by trying to live with the same grace she had shown. David sent me a letter on the anniversary of his mother's death. It was forwarded through lawyers. The envelope had been opened and read by legal staff before reaching me, standard procedure given our history. Inside was a single-page handwritten note. David's handwriting was shaky, like he had been drinking when he wrote it. The letter said he was sorry for the lawsuit, sorry for the accusations, sorry for everything. He said he had been desperate and broken and had made terrible choices. He said he thought about his mother every day and regretted not being there for her. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I read the letter 3 times. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell him I forgave him so we could both move forward, but forgiveness felt false. I was not ready to forgive, might never be ready. Forgiveness required a level of healing I had not reached. It also required trust that David was genuinely remorseful and not just trying to ease his own guilt. I did not trust him. The letter felt performative, like he was checking a box on his own path to redemption without truly understanding the damage he had caused. I put the letter in a drawer and did not respond. My silence was its own answer. My brother called me a few weeks after the anniversary. He wanted to know if I was okay. I told him I was surviving. He said surviving was not the same as living. He invited me to visit him and his family in Oregon. I had not seen them in over 2 years, had barely spoken to them during the trial because I did not want to burden them with my problems. My brother said I was not a burden. I was family, and family showed up for each other. His insistence broke something loose in me. I bought a plane ticket for the following month. The visit to Oregon was healing in unexpected ways. My brother's kids were teenagers now, busy with school and friends. They treated me normally with the casual affection of young people who love their aunt, but were not overly concerned with adult drama. My sister-in-law made my favorite meals and asked about my new job. My brother and I took long walks in the woods near his house and talked about everything except the trial. He let me just be his sister again, not the woman with the tragic story. When I left after a week, I felt lighter. Family still existed for me, just in a different form than I had expected. Back in California, I focused on building my new normal. I took a class in watercolor painting at the community college. I joined a hiking group that met on weekends. I volunteered at an animal shelter. These activities were small and ordinary, but they filled my life with purpose and structure. I was learning to be alone without being lonely. I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage. I had spent 23 years as David's wife, defined by that relationship and the work of maintaining it. Now I was just myself, and I was slowly figuring out who that person was. The criminal case against David concluded in the second year after Patricia's death. He pleaded guilty to tax fraud and was sentenced to 2 years probation and community service. He also had to pay restitution to the government and to the business partners he had defrauded. The sentence was lighter than it could have been because David cooperated fully and showed remorse. Part of his plea agreement included staying away from me. He was prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly for the duration of his probation. That legal boundary gave me peace of mind. I learned through mutual acquaintances that David had started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Apparently his debt had come partly from gambling, something he had hidden from everyone, including me. He was working a regular job in construction and living in a small apartment. His life had been reduced to basics, stripped of the ambition and pretension that had defined him for years. I felt nothing when I heard this news. No satisfaction, no pity, nothing. David had become irrelevant to me. His redemption or ruin was no longer my concern. My own life continued its slow improvement. I got a small raise at the nonprofit. I moved to a nicer apartment with a balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. I adopted a cat from the shelter, a gray tabby named Jasper, who was standoffish and independent, much like me. These small markers of stability felt like victories. I was not just surviving anymore. I was building something new, but healing was not linear. I still had hard days when the weight of everything crushed me, days when I could not get out of bed, when the memories overwhelmed me, when I questioned every decision I had ever made. Dr. Chin reminded me that trauma does not resolve neatly. It leaves echoes that resurface unpredictably. The goal was not to eliminate the pain, but to develop tools for managing it. Some days I used those tools successfully. Other days I just endured until the darkness passed. I started writing in a journal, something Dr. Chin had suggested months earlier that I had resisted. Writing felt too deliberate, too much like dwelling on the past. But eventually I tried it. I wrote about Patricia, about the good times and the bad. I wrote about David and our marriage and the betrayal. I wrote about the trial and the media attention and the loneliness. I wrote about my current life and my hopes for the future. The journal became a safe place to process feelings I could not say out loud. It helped me see patterns in my thinking and recognize progress I was making. One entry in my journal asked a question I could not answer. If I could go back in time and avoid ever meeting David, would I? The question was impossible because my entire adult life had been built around our relationship. Without David, I would not have moved to California. I would not have known Patricia. I would not have the job I loved or the friends I had made. My suffering and my growth were inseparable. I could not wish away the pain without also erasing the person I had become. It was a disturbing realization. My trauma was part of my identity now. I had been forged by it. The second anniversary of Patricia's death was quieter than the first. I visited her grave alone and brought flowers. I told her about my life, about the small victories and ongoing struggles. I thanked her again for her trust and her love, but I did not cry this time. The grief had settled into something less sharp, more like a permanent ache that I had learned to live with. Patricia would always be gone. David would always have betrayed me. These were facts I could not change. Acceptance did not mean happiness, but it meant peace. I began thinking about the future more deliberately. I was 50 years old now. I had potentially decades of life ahead of me. Did I want to spend them alone? Did I want to try dating again, despite the disaster with Richard? Did I want to relocate to be closer to my brother? Did I want to pursue a new career or stay in the nonprofit world? These questions did not have urgent answers, but they needed consideration. I was no longer in crisis mode. I was in rebuilding mode. That required vision and planning. Margaret, my boss, suggested I consider getting a certification in elder care advocacy. She said I had natural talent for navigating complex medical and legal systems on behalf of vulnerable people. The certification would formalize my skills and open up more opportunities. I enrolled in a program that met on evenings and weekends. The coursework was challenging but engaging. I was learning about patient rights, medical ethics, healthcare policy, and legal advocacy. Topics that had once been abstract were now deeply personal. One class focused specifically on end-of-life decision-making. The professor discussed advance directives, living wills, healthcare proxies, and the ethical dilemmas that arise when families disagree. I sat in that classroom listening to theoretical scenarios that mirrored my own experience. The professor talked about how medical decisions made during crisis are often criticized in hindsight, but that the people making those decisions deserve compassion and understanding. They are operating under extreme stress with incomplete information. Moral certainty is a luxury they do not have. After class, I approached the professor and told her about Patricia. I explained the situation with the ECMO machine and the lawsuit that followed. The professor listened carefully and then said something that shifted my perspective. She said that I had been in an impossible ethical bind. Patricia had expressed wishes for no extreme measures, but had not legally documented them. David was the primary decision-maker, but was incapacitated by grief. The medical team offered an option with a slim chance of success. In that context, my decision to authorize ECMO was not just reasonable, it was compassionate. I had given Patricia a chance while also sparing David from the burden of deciding to let his mother die. The professor's validation meant more than the jury's verdict. She was an expert in medical ethics, with no personal investment in my situation. Her professional assessment confirmed what I had struggled to believe about myself. I had not killed Patricia. I had not been negligent or reckless. I had been a human being trying to do right in an impossible situation. I left that classroom feeling something close to absolution. My certification program included a practicum where I worked directly with elderly clients navigating medical crises. I helped families understand treatment options, communicated with doctors on behalf of patients, and assisted with advanced directive documentation. Every client reminded me of Patricia. Every family struggling with impossible decisions reminded me of that day in the hospital. But now I could help them avoid the kind of conflict that had destroyed my life. I made sure families had clear documentation of patient wishes. I facilitated difficult conversations before crisis hit. I helped people prepare for the worst so they could make better decisions under pressure. One client, an elderly man named George, was in the same situation Patricia had been in: multi-organ failure, slim chance of survival, experimental treatment option available. His family was divided. His daughter wanted to try the experimental treatment. His son wanted to focus on comfort care. George himself was unconscious and unable to express his wishes. He had never filled out an advance directive. The family asked for my guidance. I sat with them and helped them talk through George's values and beliefs. What kind of life would he want if he survived? What would he consider unbearable suffering? Had he ever expressed opinions about medical intervention? Through careful conversation, the family realized that George had always been someone who prioritized quality of life over quantity. He had talked about not wanting to be kept alive by machines. He had been clear about his values, even if he had not formally documented them. The family decided together to focus on comfort care. George died peacefully 2 days later. The family thanked me for helping them honor their father's true wishes. That case showed me that my experience with Patricia had given me a gift. I could help other people navigate the nightmare I had lived through. My suffering had purpose. It made me a better advocate and a more compassionate guide. Patricia would have been proud. She had always believed that pain could be transformative if we let it teach us instead of destroy us. I was finally learning that lesson. My social life continued to expand slowly. Sandra introduced me to her book club. I started attending regularly and made friends with several of the members. We met monthly to discuss books, but the conversations always wandered into deeper territory. We talked about our lives, our regrets, our hopes. These women became my support system. They knew my history and accepted me anyway. They did not treat me like damaged goods or a cautionary tale. They treated me like a friend. One of the book club members, a woman named Diane, suggested I consider writing about my experience. She said my story could help other people who were dealing with family betrayal or complicated grief. The idea terrified me. Writing in my private journal was one thing. Publishing my pain for public consumption was something else entirely. But Diane persisted. She said stories like mine needed to be told because they broke the illusion that families always support each other, that love always prevails. Sometimes families destroy you. Sometimes love is not enough. People needed to know they were not alone in those experiences. I started writing small essays about specific aspects of my experience: the isolation after scandal, the complexity of grief when the person you are mourning hurt you, the challenge of rebuilding identity after divorce. I published them anonymously on a blog. The response was overwhelming. People commented, sharing their own stories of family estrangement and betrayal. They thanked me for putting words to experiences they had thought were uniquely shameful. I realized Diane was right. There was power in sharing the messy truth of survival. Encouraged by the blog response, I started working on a longer manuscript, a memoir that told the full story from Patricia's decline through the trial and my recovery. Writing it was emotionally exhausting. I had to relive every painful moment in detail, but it was also cathartic. I was taking control of my narrative instead of letting others define me. I was telling Patricia's story and honoring her memory in my own words. The manuscript took me a year to complete. I did not know if it would ever be published, but finishing it felt like an accomplishment. My 50th birthday came and went quietly. I celebrated with Sandra and a few friends from work. We had dinner at a nice restaurant and talked about everything except age and mortality. It was a good night. I went home feeling grateful for the life I had built. It was not the life I had planned or expected. It was smaller and quieter and lonelier than I had imagined at 25. But it was mine. I had earned it through survival and determination. No one could take it from me. I thought about David sometimes, usually late at night when I could not sleep. I wondered if he thought about me, if he remembered the good years before everything went wrong, if he felt genuine remorse or just regret at being caught. I wondered if he had learned anything from his consequences, or if he was just biding time until probation ended. I wondered if he ever visited his mother's grave, or if guilt kept him away. These thoughts came and went like clouds. They no longer consumed me. The manuscript I had written found its way to a small publisher through a literary agent Sandra recommended. They wanted to publish it. The advance was modest. But that was not the point. My story would be out in the world. Other people going through similar experiences would find it and know they were not alone. The publisher wanted me to use my real name, to own my story publicly. I hesitated. Using my real name meant opening myself up to more scrutiny and judgment, but anonymity felt like cowardice. Patricia had not been ashamed of me. I should not be ashamed of myself. The book was published 3 years after Patricia's death. It was called The Last Thread, a memoir of love, loss, and impossible choices. The cover was simple, just a photograph of a hospital hallway stretching into darkness. Reviews were mixed. Some critics praised the honesty and emotional depth. Others felt it was too raw and self-pitying. I did not read most of the reviews. The book was not for critics. It was for people who needed to hear that survival was possible. I did a small book tour, mostly readings at independent bookstores and libraries. At every event, people approached me afterward to share their own stories. Women who had been betrayed by husbands during crisis, children who had made impossible medical decisions for parents, families torn apart by grief and money. Each conversation reinforced that my experience, while uniquely painful, was not uniquely rare. Family conflict during medical crisis was common. Most people just suffered privately. I had made my suffering public, and that created space for others to acknowledge theirs. One woman at a reading in San Diego told me my book had saved her marriage. She and her husband had been fighting about his mother's end-of-life care. Reading about my experience helped them understand the importance of clear communication and documented wishes. They had worked together to create advanced directives for both their parents and themselves. They had confronted difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. My nightmare had helped them avoid their own. That felt like redemption. The book's modest success brought unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at medical ethics conferences about patient advocacy and family decision-making. Healthcare professionals wanted to understand the family perspective on crisis medicine. I shared Patricia's story and my own, emphasizing the importance of compassion and clear communication from medical teams. Doctors told me afterward that hearing my experience would change how they approached family meetings. They would be more careful about ensuring everyone understood options and risks. They would be more attentive to family dynamics that might complicate decisions. My life had found a strange kind of meaning. I was using my worst experience to help others avoid or navigate similar situations. It did not erase what had happened. Patricia was still gone. My marriage was still destroyed. But the suffering had been transformed into purpose. That was the best kind of healing I could hope for. I started dating again in the 4th year after Patricia's death. This time I was honest from the beginning. I told potential partners about my past, about the trial and the book and the complexity of my history. Most men backed away quickly. They did not want to deal with that much baggage. A few stayed. One man, Robert, a retired teacher, seemed genuinely interested. We dated casually for several months. He was kind and patient. He did not push for more than I could give. But ultimately, I ended things. I realized I was not ready for a serious relationship. Maybe I never would be. I had grown comfortable with solitude. Partnership no longer felt necessary for happiness. My work continued to be fulfilling. I had become a senior advocate at the nonprofit and was training new staff. I shared what I had learned through experience and education. I taught them about the emotional complexity of medical decisions, about the importance of listening to families, about recognizing when someone was making choices out of fear rather than values. My trainees were young and idealistic, eager to help. I tried to prepare them for the reality that not every case has a happy ending. Sometimes you do everything right and people still suffer. Patricia's estate, which had seemed small at first, had been invested wisely and grown over the years. I used some of the money to establish a small scholarship fund in her name. The scholarship supported low-income students pursuing careers in healthcare or social work. Each year, 2 students received awards that covered books and supplies. It was a small legacy, but it felt right. Patricia had been a librarian who believed in education and helping others. The scholarship honored both those values. I visited Patricia's grave less frequently as time passed, but the visits were more peaceful. I no longer went burdened by guilt and grief. I went to share good news and express gratitude. I told her about the book, about the scholarship, about the people I was helping through my work. I told her that her trust in me had been the foundation of my recovery. She had believed I was worth protecting, and that belief had carried me through the darkest times. I hoped she knew, wherever she was, that her faith had not been misplaced. My relationship with my brother strengthened over the years. We talked regularly on the phone and visited each other twice a year. His kids were in college now, building their own lives. We had become the kind of family that stayed connected despite distance. My brother told me he was proud of how I had rebuilt my life. He said most people would have been destroyed by what I went through, but I had found a way to not just survive, but contribute meaningfully to the world. His pride meant everything to me. The 5th anniversary of Patricia's death marked a turning point in my healing. I had spent 5 years processing trauma, rebuilding my identity, and finding purpose in advocacy work, but I realized I was still living in reaction to what had happened. My entire life had been shaped by Patricia's death and David's betrayal. I had built something meaningful from the wreckage, but I had not yet built something truly mine. I decided it was time to stop defining myself by what I had survived and start defining myself by what I wanted to create. I applied for a director position at a larger nonprofit organization in San Francisco. The job would mean relocating, leaving behind the life I had carefully constructed in Pasadena. It felt risky. I had stability and comfort. My apartment, my friends, my routine, all provided safety. But safety was not the same as growth. I was 53 years old and needed to know if I was capable of something bigger than maintaining equilibrium. I needed to test myself. The interview process was rigorous. Multiple rounds of meetings with board members and staff. Presentations on my vision for elder advocacy and organizational growth. Reference checks that required me to explain my history once again. I was honest about everything. I told them about Patricia, about the trial, about the book. I explained how my personal experience informed my professional perspective. The board appreciated my transparency. They saw my history as an asset rather than a liability. They offered me the position with a significant salary increase. Moving to San Francisco was both exciting and terrifying. I sold most of my furniture and packed what remained into a small truck. Jasper the cat was unimpressed with the disruption, but adapted quickly to the new apartment. The neighborhood was different from Pasadena, more urban and diverse. I could walk to work and to dozens of restaurants and shops. The pace of life was faster. I felt anonymous in the city, which was liberating. No one knew my story unless I chose to share it. The new job challenged me in ways I had not experienced in years. The organization was larger and more complex. I managed a team of 12 advocates and oversaw a budget in the millions. There were political dynamics to navigate, donors to cultivate, and strategic decisions that affected hundreds of clients. I made mistakes in the first few months, misjudging situations and struggling with the administrative burden. But I learned quickly. My staff was talented and patient with my learning curve. Within 6 months, I had found my rhythm. One of my first major initiatives was to create a program specifically focused on family mediation during medical crises. I had seen too many families torn apart by disagreements over care decisions. The program would provide trained mediators who could help families communicate effectively and reach consensus that honored patient wishes. We would also help families create advance directives before crisis hit, preventing the kind of chaos I had experienced. The board approved the program and provided funding for a pilot year. The family mediation program launched with 3 mediators and served 20 families in its first 6 months. The results were remarkable. Families reported feeling heard and supported. Medical decisions were made collaboratively rather than through conflict. Several families avoided legal battles that would have destroyed their relationships. One daughter sent me a letter thanking me for creating the program. She said it had saved her relationship with her brother during their mother's final illness. They had been headed toward the kind of bitter dispute I had experienced with David, but mediation helped them work through their differences. Reading that letter, I felt Patricia's presence. This was her legacy continuing through my work. My personal life in San Francisco started slowly. I joined a gym and took yoga classes. I attended events at a local community center. I met people casually but did not push for deep connections. I was learning to be comfortable with a smaller social circle, quality over quantity. I had Sandra, who visited from Pasadena several times. I had my brother and his family. I had colleagues who became friends. That was enough. I started seeing a new therapist in San Francisco, Dr. Patel, who specialized in post-traumatic growth. She introduced me to research showing that many people who experience severe trauma eventually find benefits from their suffering. They develop deeper empathy, stronger relationships, greater appreciation for life, and clearer priorities. This was not the same as saying trauma was good or necessary. It was acknowledging that humans have remarkable capacity to find meaning in suffering. Dr. Patel helped me see that my growth was not despite my trauma, but through it. One session with Dr. Patel focused on forgiveness. She asked if I had forgiven David. I said no. She asked if I wanted to forgive him. I said I did not know. Forgiveness felt like letting him off the hook, like saying what he did was acceptable. Dr. Patel explained that forgiveness was not about David. It was about me releasing the anger and resentment that still took up space in my heart. Forgiveness did not require reconciliation or forgetting. It just meant accepting what happened and choosing to stop letting it poison my present. That reframing helped, but I still was not ready. Maybe someday, maybe never. I gave myself permission for both possibilities. The book continued to generate occasional attention. I received emails from readers sharing their stories and asking for advice. Some wanted to know how I had survived financially. Others wanted to know how I had rebuilt my social life. Many wanted to know if I still loved David despite everything. That last question was the hardest to answer. I had loved the man I thought David was, but that man might never have existed. The David I knew had been a construction, a story I told myself to make sense of our relationship. The real David, the one capable of betrayal and cruelty, was someone I had never truly known. So did I still love him? I loved a ghost, a memory of someone who was never real. My work brought me into contact with people facing impossible moral decisions regularly. I met families choosing between aggressive treatment and comfort care. I met patients deciding whether to pursue experimental therapies with terrible side effects. I met spouses weighing their own needs against their partner's medical requirements. Every situation was unique, but they all shared a common thread. There were no perfect choices. Every option involved sacrifice and uncertainty. The best anyone could do was gather information, clarify values, and make the least bad choice available. This perspective helped me finally put my decision about Patricia's ECMO treatment into proper context. I had not made a mistake. I had made a choice among bad options. The outcome had been tragic, but that did not mean the decision was wrong. If I had refused ECMO and Patricia had died immediately, that would also have been tragic. If the ECMO had worked and Patricia had survived with severe disabilities, that would have been tragic in a different way. There was no path that avoided tragedy. Patricia's body was failing. Her death was inevitable. I had simply chosen which form that death would take, and I had chosen the option that gave David hope and Patricia a chance. That was not murder. That was love operating under impossible constraints. Reaching this level of acceptance took 6 years. 6 years of therapy and self-reflection and helping others face similar choices. 6 years of carrying guilt that slowly transformed into understanding. I could not change what happened. I could only change how I carried it. And I was finally learning to carry it without being crushed. The nonprofit continued to grow under my leadership. We expanded services to 3 additional counties. The family mediation program became so successful that other organizations asked us to train their staff in our methods. I was invited to present at national conferences and contribute to academic papers on patient advocacy. My professional reputation was strong and respected. I had become an expert in a field I had never planned to enter. Patricia's death had given me both a calling and the credibility to pursue it effectively. My 55th birthday arrived on a Saturday. I celebrated by hiking alone in the marine headlands, looking out over the Pacific Ocean. The day was clear and bright. I thought about how much had changed in the 10 years since I met Patricia for tea and learned she was moving to California. That decision had set everything else in motion. If Patricia had stayed in Kentucky, she would have died there, surrounded by different people, making different choices. I would still be married to David, probably miserable but stable. I would not have discovered his fraud or his cruelty. I would not have found my calling in advocacy work. My life would have been completely different. It was impossible to say if that alternate life would have been better or worse. Different does not mean better. It just means different. I had the life I had. It was built on loss and pain and hard-won resilience. It was not the life I would have chosen, but it was a life I could be proud of. I had survived. I had helped others survive. I had honored Patricia's memory by becoming someone worthy of her trust. That had to be enough. As I stood on that hillside overlooking the ocean, I realized I was no longer angry. The rage that had sustained me through the trial and the early years of recovery had finally burned itself out. I felt something closer to sadness, the deep sadness of recognizing that life is often unfair and painful, and that love is not always enough to protect us. But underneath the sadness was something else. A quiet strength, a knowledge that I could handle whatever came next because I had already handled the worst. I thought about David for the last time in a long time. I hoped he had found some measure of peace. I hoped he had learned from his mistakes and was living a life of integrity, however modest. I hoped he thought about his mother with love rather than guilt. I hoped he understood, even if he could never admit it, that I had tried to do right by Patricia. And I hoped he had let go of his resentment toward me the way I was learning to let go of mine toward him. Not forgiveness exactly, just release. The acknowledgement that we had both been broken by circumstances and had broken each other in return, and that holding on to that brokenness served no purpose. I returned to my apartment that evening feeling lighter. Jasper greeted me with his usual indifference, which made me smile. I made dinner and settled in to read a new book Sandra had recommended. It was a novel about a woman rebuilding her life after loss. The story was different from mine, but the emotional landscape was familiar. The protagonist struggled with guilt and identity, and the question of whether she could ever be whole again. By the end of the book, she had not found complete healing, but she had found purpose and moments of joy. It was a realistic ending. Life after trauma does not tie up neatly. The question of whether justice was worth the cost haunted me for years, but the answer became clearer with time and distance. Justice was not optional. It was survival. David had not simply ended our marriage or blamed me in private grief. He had weaponized his mother's death to destroy me financially and socially. He had filed a lawsuit designed to bankrupt me and protect his insurance payout. If I had not fought back, I would have been crushed under the weight of false accusations and legal judgments. Fighting was not revenge, it was self-defense. The man I loved had already been lost long before the trial. I was fighting a stranger wearing my husband's face. The work at the nonprofit consumed my days, but in a fulfilling way. Each client I helped represented a small victory against the chaos and cruelty I had experienced. An elderly woman whose children were fighting over her care found peace through our mediation services. A man with terminal cancer was able to document his wishes clearly so his family would not have to guess. A daughter learned to advocate effectively for her father without alienating the medical team. These were not dramatic rescues. They were quiet acts of preservation, keeping families intact during their most vulnerable moments. I received a call one afternoon from a lawyer I did not recognize. She represented a woman named Helen who was facing a situation eerily similar to mine. Helen's husband had died after she authorized an experimental treatment. His adult children from a previous marriage were suing her for wrongful death, claiming she had acted against their father's wishes to secure his estate for herself. The lawyer had read my book and thought I might be willing to serve as an expert witness. Helen needed someone who could testify about the complexity of medical decision-making during crisis and the emotional factors that complicate family dynamics. I agreed to meet with Helen and her legal team. Helen was 62, a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She reminded me of Patricia in some ways, that same quality of quiet strength eroded by circumstance. She told me her story. Her husband Tom had developed aggressive leukemia. The doctors offered a risky bone marrow transplant as his only chance at survival. Tom's adult children, who had been estranged from him for years, suddenly appeared and argued against the transplant. They said their father would not want to suffer through the procedure and recovery. But Tom, while scared, had chosen to try. He signed consent forms. Helen supported his decision. The transplant failed. Tom developed complications and died 3 weeks later. His children immediately filed a wrongful death suit, claiming Helen had pressured Tom into the procedure against his better retry continue edit judgment. They argued that Helen had influenced him because she stood to inherit his estate, which included a house and retirement accounts worth nearly $1 million. The case was scheduled for trial in 4 months. Helen was terrified and exhausted. She had already spent tens of thousands on legal fees, and the children were demanding she settle for half the estate. Listening to Helen, I felt rage on her behalf. The pattern was identical to what David had done to me. A medical crisis, a difficult decision made in good faith, and then a lawsuit weaponizing grief and finances to destroy someone who had been a faithful partner. Helen was being punished for supporting her husband's choice, for standing by him during treatment, for being the person who stayed when others left. I told her I would testify. I would help her fight this injustice. Preparing to testify meant revisiting my own case in detail. I reviewed trial transcripts and evidence. I relived those awful months in ways I had successfully avoided for years. But it was necessary. Helen needed someone who could speak with authority about the emotional manipulation and financial motives that drive wrongful death suits in family contexts. I could provide that perspective better than any academic expert because I had lived it. The trial was held in Sacramento. I drove up the day before to meet with Helen's legal team and review my testimony. The lawyers were sharp and prepared. They had built a strong case showing that Tom had made his own decision about the transplant, that Helen had supported but not coerced him, and that the children's lawsuit was motivated by greed rather than genuine concern for their father's wishes. My role was to provide context about how these situations typically unfold and to counter the plaintiff's claims that Helen's behavior was suspicious or negligent. Taking the stand felt surreal. I was back in a courtroom under oath, answering questions about medical crises and family betrayal. But this time I was not defending myself. I was defending someone else. That shift in role gave me power I had not felt during my own trial. I testified about the complexity of medical decision-making, about how family members who are absent during caregiving often arrive during crisis with unrealistic expectations and second-guess decisions. I explained how lawsuits like this one are frequently motivated by financial interests disguised as concern for the deceased's dignity. The plaintiff's attorney tried to discredit me during cross-examination. He pointed out that I was not a medical professional or a lawyer, just someone who had been sued and written a book about it. He suggested my testimony was biased because I was projecting my own situation onto Helen's case. I stayed calm and responded that lived experience was a form of expertise, that understanding the emotional and psychological dimensions of these cases required more than academic knowledge. The jury seemed to respond well. Several members nodded as I spoke. Helen's case went to the jury after a week-long trial. The verdict came back in her favor. The wrongful death suit was dismissed, and Helen was awarded attorney fees from the plaintiffs. It was a complete victory. Helen cried when the verdict was read. Afterwards, she hugged me and thanked me for helping her fight. She said knowing someone else had survived a similar attack gave her courage to stand firm instead of settling. I told her she had survived through her own strength, that I had just shared my story. But I knew my testimony had mattered. It had provided validation and context that shifted the narrative from suspicious widow to devoted wife. Helping Helen win her case gave me a sense of completion I had not expected. My suffering had directly prevented someone else from being destroyed by the same tactics. Patricia's death and David's betrayal had taught me lessons that protected Helen. The pain had been transformed into protection. That felt like the closest thing to redemption I would ever experience. I drove back to San Francisco feeling something close to peace. The family mediation program I'd started continued expanding. We trained mediators in 4 additional cities and partnered with hospitals to integrate our services into their palliative care programs. Doctors began calling us routinely when they identified families at risk of conflict. We intervened early before positions hardened and communication broke down. Our success rate was remarkable. Over 80% of families who used our services reported feeling satisfied with the medical decisions they made and maintained family relationships afterward. I was invited to speak at a medical ethics conference in Chicago about the intersection of family dynamics and end-of-life care. The audience included doctors, nurses, social workers, and hospital administrators. I told Patricia's story and my own, explaining how lack of clear advance directives and poor family communication had created the conditions for tragedy. I talked about how medical teams could better identify families at risk and intervene with mediation services before a crisis escalated. The response was overwhelming. Multiple hospitals approached me afterward wanting to implement similar programs. The speaking engagement led to consulting opportunities. Hospitals paid me to review their policies and train staff on family-centered care during medical crises. I traveled frequently, spending weeks at different medical centers across the country. The work was exhausting but meaningful. I was changing systems, not just helping individual families. Every hospital that adopted better practices would prevent countless conflicts, like the one that had destroyed my marriage. My personal life remained quiet and solitary. I dated occasionally, but nothing developed into a serious relationship. I had accepted that I might spend the rest of my life alone. That no longer felt like failure. Solitude had become comfortable, even preferable. I valued my independence and the freedom to focus completely on work that mattered. Romantic partnership would require compromise and vulnerability I was not sure I could offer. The walls I had built to survive were not easily dismantled. Sandra suggested I was using work as an excuse to avoid intimacy. She said I had not actually healed from David's betrayal, just found productive ways to avoid dealing with it. Her observation stung because it contained truth. I was afraid to trust anyone completely again. David had been my partner for 23 years and had turned on me when circumstances made it profitable. If someone I knew that deeply could betray me so thoroughly, how could I ever trust a stranger? Sandra said I was giving David too much power, letting his actions define my capacity for future relationships. She was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different processes. I turned 57. My hair was completely gray now. I had stopped dyeing it years ago. The lines on my face were deep. I looked like someone who had lived through hardship. I felt like it too. But I also felt strong in ways I had not been in my youth. I knew what I was capable of surviving. I knew my own resilience. Those were worth the cost written on my face. The nonprofit board approached me about succession planning. I had been director for 4 years, and the organization was thriving, but I was not getting younger, and they needed to think about long-term leadership. They asked if I planned to stay another 5 years, or if they should begin identifying my replacement. The question forced me to consider my future more seriously. Did I want to keep doing this work until I was too old to continue? Or did I want to try something new while I still had energy? I decided to stay another 3 years and then transition to part-time consulting. That would give me time to mentor a successor and ensure program continuity, while also creating space for other pursuits. I wanted to write another book, this time not about my own experience, but about the families I had worked with. A book that showed the full spectrum of medical crisis situations and how families navigated them successfully. I wanted to capture the complexity and offer practical guidance without reducing anyone's story to a cautionary tale. The decision to plan my departure from full-time work felt liberating. I had poured 8 years into building this program and organization. It would continue without me because I had built something sustainable. That realization was satisfying in a deep way. I had created legacy beyond my own story. The work would outlast me and continue helping people long after I was gone. I visited Patricia's grave on what would have been her 80th birthday. I brought yellow roses and sat on the grass beside her headstone. I told her about Helen's case and the expanded mediation program. I told her about the hospitals changing their policies because of work that grew from her death. I told her that her suffering had not been meaningless, that it had catalyzed changes that were protecting others. I hoped she would have been proud. I hoped she understood that I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and refused to let it be only destructive. Sitting there in the cemetery, I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed. The young woman who fell in love with David and believed in happily ever after. The wife who supported her husband through his failures and cared for his mother. The person frozen in that hospital corridor trying to make an impossible decision. The defendant sitting in a courtroom being accused of murder. The divorced woman rebuilding from nothing. The advocate helping others navigate crises. Each version had been necessary to become who I was now. I could not regret any of them without erasing myself. The answer to that question evolved over the years, until it became something I could finally articulate with certainty. The man I loved was already gone before I ever fought back. David disappeared the moment he chose to blame me for his mother's death rather than grieve with me. He vanished completely when he filed a lawsuit designed to destroy me financially and emotionally. The person I fought in court was not my husband. He was a desperate stranger who happened to share a history with me. So I did not lose the man I loved by fighting back. I simply acknowledged that he no longer existed and protected myself from the predator who had taken his place. That distinction mattered. For years I tormented myself with the idea that my choice to fight had ended my marriage, but the marriage was already over. David had ended it when he prioritized money over truth, when he weaponized his mother's death, when he committed fraud and blamed everyone except himself. I could have surrendered and let him win. I could have accepted false blame and paid him settlement money I did not have. That would not have saved our marriage. It would have only rewarded his cruelty and left me destroyed. Fighting back was the most loving thing I could have done for myself. It was self-preservation disguised as revenge, and it was the most respectful thing I could have done for Patricia's memory. She had trusted me with her care and protected me in her will because she knew David was unreliable. Letting him profit from lies about her death would have dishonored everything she believed about integrity and truth. I fought for both of us, for the widow and the dead mother-in-law against the son and husband who had failed us both. The consulting work I did with hospitals brought me into contact with medical residents and nursing students. I was asked to guest lecture on family dynamics in healthcare settings. Standing in front of these young professionals, I saw their idealism and their fear. They were being trained in medicine, but not in the emotional complexity of treating human beings embedded in family systems. I taught them that every patient comes with a web of relationships that affect care decisions. I taught them to identify warning signs of family conflict before crisis hit. I taught them that their job included not just treating disease, but supporting families through impossible situations. One resident asked me during a question period if I ever regretted authorizing the ECMO machine for Patricia. The room went silent. Everyone wanted to know the answer, but had been too polite to ask. I thought carefully before responding. I said that I regretted the outcome, but not the decision. I had made the choice that offered hope and spared David from having to let his mother die. Given the same circumstances and information, I would make the same choice again. Regret was a luxury available only in hindsight with complete information. In the moment of decision, I had done my best. That had to be enough. The resident nodded and thanked me. After the lecture, she approached me privately. She said her own mother was dying of cancer, and the family was divided about treatment options. She was terrified of making the wrong choice and destroying her family. I told her there was no perfect choice, only the least bad option available. I told her to focus on her mother's values and wishes, not on preventing family conflict. I told her to document everything and communicate clearly, and I told her to forgive herself in advance for whatever happened because guilt was inevitable but did not equal wrongdoing. 6 months later, that resident sent me an email. Her mother had died after they chose to stop chemotherapy and focus on comfort care. Her siblings had been angry initially, but the clear documentation of their mother's wishes had prevented lasting conflict. The family had grieved together instead of turning on each other. She thanked me for the guidance that had helped them navigate the crisis with integrity intact. Reading her email, I cried. Not from sadness, but from gratitude that my suffering had created wisdom I could share. I began work on my second book during my final year as full-time director. The manuscript wove together stories from dozens of families I had worked with, showing the spectrum of medical crisis situations and how different families navigated them. Some stories ended well, with families making joint decisions that honored patient wishes. Other stories ended badly, with conflict and regret. I tried to present each situation without judgment, showing how good people could make different choices based on their values and circumstances. The book also included updated reflections on my own experience. 10 years of distance had given me perspective I lacked when writing the first memoir. I could see now how my trauma response had shaped my initial narrative. I had been angrier and more defensive in the first book, still actively fighting for my reputation. In this second book, I could acknowledge complexity and ambiguity I had been unable to access before. David was not simply a villain. He was a broken person who made terrible choices under pressure. That did not excuse his actions, but it explained them. Writing about David with more nuance felt like a final release. I was not forgiving him exactly, but I was letting go of the need to cast him as purely evil. People were complicated. David had loved his mother, but he had also failed her. He had loved me once, but he had also betrayed me. Both things could be true. Holding both truths simultaneously was a kind of peace. It meant accepting that life was messier than narratives usually allowed. My last year as full-time director focused on transitioning leadership to my successor, a talented advocate named Marcus, who had worked under me for 3 years. Marcus was young and energetic, full of ideas for expanding services. I mentored him through budget management, board relations, and strategic planning. Watching him grow into the role reminded me of my own journey. He would make mistakes and learn from them, just as I had. The organization would change under his leadership, but it would continue thriving. That was how legacy worked. You built something strong enough to evolve beyond your vision. My retirement party was held at the nonprofit office on a Friday evening. Staff, board members, clients, and colleagues filled the small space. People gave speeches thanking me for my leadership and sharing stories about how the programs I had built had helped their families. Several clients spoke about how mediation services had kept their families together during medical crises. One woman said I had saved her relationship with her sister. A man said I had given him tools to advocate for his dying father without alienating his stepmother. Each story was a small miracle, a family that had not been destroyed. Sandra flew up from Pasadena for the party. My brother and his wife drove down from Oregon. Having them there meant everything. They represented continuity, the relationships that had survived all the upheaval. Sandra gave a speech about how I had rebuilt myself from nothing and turned tragedy into purpose. My brother talked about my resilience and how proud our parents would have been. I cried during their speeches, overwhelmed by gratitude for people who had never abandoned me. At the end of the evening, I gave my own brief remarks. I thanked everyone for their support and for believing in the work we had built together. I said the programs would continue growing under Marcus's leadership and that I was excited to see where he would take the organization. I said that my time as director had been the most meaningful work of my life and that I was grateful for every family we had been able to help. I did not mention Patricia or David explicitly, but everyone in that room knew where this work had come from. They knew that every family we saved was a kind of redemption for the family I had lost. Transitioning to part-time consulting freed up my schedule dramatically. I worked only 15 hours a week, mostly training programs at hospitals and guest lecturing. The rest of my time was my own. I took up painting again, something I had not done since college. I joined a community art studio and spent mornings working on canvases. I was not particularly talented, but the process was meditative. It gave my hands something to do while my mind processed thoughts and memories. I also started volunteering at a hospice, sitting with dying patients who had no family or whose families could not be present. I read to them, held their hands, and kept them company in their final days. It was hard work emotionally, but it felt important. Patricia had not died alone because I had been there. These strangers would not die alone because I chose to be there. It was a small way to honor her memory and extend the care she had shown me to others who needed it. One patient, an elderly woman named Rose, reminded me strongly of Patricia. She had the same gentle manner and the same appreciation for small kindnesses. Rose was dying of heart failure. Her children lived across the country and could not afford to fly out. She was sad about dying alone, but accepted it with grace. I visited her every day for the 2 weeks before she died. We talked about her life, her regrets, her pride in her children despite their absence. She told me she was not afraid of death, just sad to leave the world behind. Rose died on a Tuesday morning with me holding her hand. Her last words were thanking me for being there. After she passed, I sat with her body for a while, the way I had sat with Patricia's. I thought about how strange it was that I had become the person who showed up for dying strangers, that my own experience of medical crisis and death had prepared me for this role. Rose's children called later that day to thank me for being with their mother. They felt guilty for not being there, but grateful she had not been alone. I understood their guilt. Guilt was part of grief, even when you had done nothing wrong. My second book was published 8 months after I retired from full-time work. It was called Holding Space, Families, Medical Crises, and the Choices We Make Together. The reception was warmer than the first book. Critics praised the empathy and practical guidance. Healthcare professionals adopted it as a teaching text. Families dealing with medical crises wrote to say it had helped them navigate their own situations. The book became a resource in ways the first memoir had not, less focused on my personal story and more focused on universal challenges. Book tours for the second book were different from the first. I was no longer a wounded survivor telling her traumatic story. I was an expert sharing knowledge earned through experience and expanded through years of professional work. The audiences were different too. More medical professionals and social workers. Fewer people looking for validation of their own trauma. The conversations were about systems and solutions rather than shared suffering. It felt like growth. I turned 60 during a book tour stop in Boston. Sandra had flown out to surprise me. We had dinner at an expensive restaurant overlooking the harbor. She gave me a bracelet engraved with Patricia's initials and the dates of her birth and death. Sandra said she knew I did not need reminders, but wanted me to have something physical to carry Patricia with me. I wore the bracelet every day after that. It became part of me, a small weight on my wrist that grounded me in memory and purpose. Sandra asked me during that dinner if I had any regrets about how my life had turned out. I thought about the question seriously. I regretted the pain, the loss, the years of suffering. I regretted that Patricia had died badly and that David had become someone capable of cruelty. I regretted the failure of my marriage and the destruction of the life I had built over 2 decades. But I did not regret fighting back. I did not regret building a career from my trauma. I did not regret the person I had become. Regret was complicated. You could regret the journey while valuing the destination. My life now, at 60, was small and quiet and purposeful. I lived alone except for Jasper, who was ancient and slept most of the day. I worked part-time doing meaningful consulting. I volunteered at hospice. I painted. I maintained close relationships with a handful of people who mattered. I visited Patricia's grave several times a year. I had enough money to be comfortable. I had respect in my professional field. I had peace most days. It was not the life I had imagined at 30, but it was a good life. It was my life. Looking back over the decades since Patricia died, I could see how every piece had been necessary. The crisis, the decision, the accusation, the lawsuit, the trial, the vindication, the recovery, the advocacy work, the teaching, the writing. Each piece had built on the previous one, creating a path I could not have predicted but could now see had been leading somewhere meaningful all along. Patricia's death had been the catalyst, but my choices about how to respond had determined the outcome. I had chosen to fight rather than surrender. I had chosen to build rather than collapse. I had chosen purpose over bitterness. My mother-in-law rests in peace, and my name is finally clear, but the silence in my life is deafening. I lost my husband, my home, and the life I built over 20 years. I know I will never have a normal life again. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to execute this final revenge, because this decision broke the last thread of connection we had. Was the justice I found worth losing the man I loved forever? The answer, finally, after all these years, is yes. The justice was worth it. Not because it brought happiness or erased pain, but because it allowed me to live with myself, to honor Patricia's trust, and to build something meaningful from the wreckage. I did not lose the man I loved by fighting back. I acknowledged that he was already gone and refused to be destroyed by his ghost. That was not revenge. That was survival. And survival, I have learned, is its own form of victory.